Welcome to the Pure Parenthood podcast, brought to you by Purebaby. I'm your host, Tiffany Wells, and I'm the head educator here at Purebaby. Hi everyone, today we welcome nutritionist and dietitian Olivia Bates from Nourishing Bubs back to our podcast. This week's episode's all about allergies in babies. It's good to have you back, Olivia.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. I'm so excited to be back and to be chatting about this topic, which always comes up with parents when I'm chatting to them about starting solids.
I couldn't agree with you more. It can be such a challenging time to introduce solids and also just talking about allergies and understanding them. So I really appreciate you coming on to discuss this important topic with us today and all of our listeners. So Liv, to kick off today's episode, could you tell us a little bit more about allergies and an overview of allergies and what's involved?
Absolutely. So when it comes to introducing babies to solids and the whole topic of allergies, there has been quite a few changes around the recommendations to do with this in the last few years. This is why often if you're talking to friends with older children, you might find that they had different recommendations when their children were younger. So it doesn't mean that the recommendations were wrong. It's just that obviously new research has come to light that has resulted in changes to the recommendations. Yeah, so the real key difference is that back about 5 years ago, they used to say that you should hold on the introduction of allergens until your child was 2 or even 3 years of age. Now, basically what they found through a number of studies that have been done is that they actually now advise you to introduce the allergens in the first year of baby's life and by the time that the child is 11 months old. This is because they actually found that delaying the introduction of those allergens has actually resulted in an increase of children with allergies, which is why we've just seen such a spike in children with egg allergies, milk allergies, peanut allergies, and why there's all those recommendations and restrictions when it comes to what children can take to school. So I guess one thing worth mentioning is that there is a key difference between allergies and intolerances. So sometimes when you are talking about allergies, people will say, oh, like I have a lactose intolerance, and they'll think that that is an allergy. However, the key difference is that a typical food allergy actually results in an immune response where the body basically perceives the food that you consume as a harmful substance and basically generates this immune response. On the other hand, an intolerance results in something more like issues around the digestive system. So it might result in some vomiting, some diarrhea, some gas, and some more uncomfortable symptoms as a result to having an actual immune response.
Yeah, wow, things have evolved so much when it comes to understanding more about allergies and intolerances. It's great to know that there's so much research that's been done in this area now, I think, to help inform and support parents and families. So what are some of the most common food allergies, Liv?
Yeah, so when we talk about our most common allergens, there are a few key ones. And to be honest, this list is constantly growing, and every year or every couple of years, it tends to be revised and we do have things added. But in terms of what is considered the most common allergens right now, we're talking about cow's milk protein. So not lactose again, but the actual milk protein.
Yeah.
Also eggs, peanuts, tree nuts, which also includes sesame seeds, soy, wheat, gluten, fish and shellfish. And when it comes to these, you will actually always see on food labels that they will be highlighted. They have to be declared on food labels and they will appear in bold. In saying that, there also are other foods that definitely can cause allergies for certain people. However, these are what are considered our most common allergens.
Yeah, well, I remember we touched on allergens a little in our last episode last year. So it's great that we're delving into this topic a bit more today, because I think a lot of our listeners will really be keen to know more about this specific topic. So Liv, do babies get allergies, and what sort of causes them typically?
Yeah, so I guess when it comes to allergies, obviously there is a whole lot of research that has been done around them, but unfortunately there's still a lot that we don't know, and in particular we don't actually know what is causing them. In saying that, there definitely is some kind of genetic link, and we do know that, and basically what we do say is that if one parent or two parents have an allergy, then your child is definitely more likely to develop allergies themselves. Now, we consider a child that has one parent with an allergy a moderate risk of developing a food allergy. And when it's two parents, we'd consider them at high risk of developing a food allergy.
Yeah, well, I've definitely experienced this in the intolerances aspect. So I've got 3 kids, and 2 of them actually developed intolerances to certain foods that either I had or their dad had, but the other child didn't really have any intolerances to things. So it's really tough to work out, that's for sure. So can babies get allergy tests?
Yeah, sure. So, now when it comes to babies actually being tested for allergies, the first port of call would definitely be to discuss it with your doctor. So if you do suspect that your child has some kind of allergy, the first recommendation would be to cease giving them that food and then to take them to the doctor and discuss it. The other key thing I would definitely recommend would be keeping a food diary, because as soon as you ultimately do go to see an allergist, what they're going to ask you is to keep some kind of food diary. And if you are ahead of the ball and have already kept that food diary, it will really help for them to determine what is causing that allergy. There might be some other foods that you haven't even thought of that might cause them.
That's a great idea. I mean, why wouldn't you? It makes so much sense if there's something that you think might be causing a problem.
Yeah, definitely. And there are definitely a few key tests that we do talk about when it comes to determining whether a child does have allergies. However, in saying that, it is generally recommended that we wait until the child is a little bit older, or you have to go and actually see a specialist pediatric allergist. Now, the reason is that we note that if you do what's called a skin prick test, so basically what happens with a skin prick test is that they would basically put some little pricks in the child or the adult's skin, and then they would apply part of the allergen to them. And they basically watch for what is called a wheal and a flare. And so basically it creates a welt around where the allergen has been applied. And they basically look at that and measure those welts to determine if there is an allergy. In saying that, children's skin is super sensitive, as is also for older people. So older people, it is also harder to tell. So you really do need to see a special pediatric allergist to determine an allergy in children under 2 years. And that can be really, really hard to get into. So sometimes you will find the process of you potentially identifying an allergen versus when you can actually be diagnosed, there can be quite a delay and lag in that period. And it's not always that easy to identify, particularly for children under 1. So if you do go to the doctor, you might find that they say, I'd wait till they get a little bit older before we go through that testing process.
Okay, well, that makes sense, I guess. But it's great to know that there's that support out there and there are ways in which you can find out. So thanks so much. I'm sure parents out there will really appreciate knowing all that. And I know you mentioned a little bit about the skin prick, but what are the sort of steps involved in typical testing?
Yeah, sure. So basically it involves this series of tiny pricks which are made on the skin and then the allergen being applied to each of them. And they will test for a lot of different allergens, not just what you suspect to be the allergy. Because, for example, if your child might have a allergy to peanuts, then it is very likely that they might also have an allergy to some other nuts as well, for example. So they will always test for more than just the one thing that's suspected.
Right.
Now, then basically what happens is a small itchy lump will develop, and it's called a wheal, and it will be surrounded by a red flare. And the size of the wheal is basically compared to a control, and it is then measured. And it is a very subjective thing to determine, because they do need to obviously measure it. And obviously it does depend on the different doctor to how they measure it. So it can be quite a subjective thing, which is why it's often can be quite particularly hard with younger children. Now, in some cases, skin prick tests will be contraindicated. So basically they wouldn't recommend it. This usually occurs if the child has particularly bad eczema, because a child needs to have, or an adult needs to have, very clean skin to actually do the skin prick testing. In this situation, they would do what we call an allergen-specific blood test. This used to be known as RAS testing. And so basically they do a blood test that can test the antibodies to that particular allergen. This is definitely not the gold standard. The gold standard would be a skin prick test, but it is used when they can't carry out a skin prick test.
Yeah, well, that makes sense. And thanks so much for going into a bit more detail there. I know you covered a bit, but I think understanding a bit further could be really helpful, because it can be quite daunting, I think, for any new parent to take their child in to be tested for anything. It's a bit scary. So knowing what the process is and why it's done can be really helpful. So how accurate are the results typically, though, Liv, when you do get these tests back? You said that they're not always great.
Yeah, so I guess that's one thing that you do definitely need to consider. If you have to go for the option of the blood test, it is not as specific as doing the skin prick testing, which is why it's not the gold standard. Now, if you are doing the skin prick testing, obviously the reaction can vary from child to child. So each child is not going to have, it's not a black and white test. It really does depend on the way that the test is carried out, and also the way that the results are interpreted by the doctor. Also, just the time that they wait to actually measure the size of the wheel can also impact the results. So they really do need to be very carefully interpreted and need to also be interpreted in relation to the patient's other clinical history. So it is a very careful process that needs to be carried out by an allergist only. So it's not something that just your GP could do. So basically the allergist would work with the family to develop an appropriate allergy management plan, interpreting the results and thinking about also other factors that might contribute to avoidance or, exposure to the offending food.
Yeah, this is also great to know. I think it helps people to really understand the degree of these types of testing and then what's involved, and just gives you a bit more confidence, I think. Knowing more, I always say knowledge is power, so knowing more about this can be really helpful and just alleviate some stress, I think. So what are common allergy symptoms to look out for typically in most allergies or reactions that people have?
So with allergies, I guess the key thing to note is that an allergic reaction will generally take place between 5 minutes and 2 hours of consuming the offending food. This is a general rule. There are some instances where it might take longer.
Okay.
But what signs that you're really looking for often will be a rash. So quite a big rash might result in welts. It obviously can vary from child to child. Swelling around the mouth, itching around the mouth, a stuffy nose, sneezing, runny nose, also things like issues around the lungs, so like wheezing, coughing, asthma, and even swelling around. One of the worst things that is often swelling around the throat that basically can interfere with their airway. Obviously, this is one of the worst case scenarios, so don't think it's commonplace, but it is definitely worth mentioning. Also things like digestive system issues, so things like stomach pains, projectile vomiting, diarrhea. So there are quite a number of things that will often take place: itchy eyes, watering eyes, and even, irritability, fatigue, and another worst case scenario would be something like convulsions.
As a new parent, it can be quite alarming to see some of the things happening to a little one that's not normal too. So I remember she had actually got heat rashes quite often. And the first time she got that heat rash, I remember I was so worried, but once I found out what it was such a relief. So I think that it's so extremely helpful to know about some of the common signs and symptoms when it comes to, knowing what to look out for with allergic reactions and allergens and things. So thanks so much for sharing all that with us today. So how do you treat allergies in babies normally? What are the types of things you would do to treat a baby if they had an allergic reaction to a food?
So unfortunately at this stage, there is actually no cure for allergies, although they are always working on it. So basically, once an allergy is diagnosed, the best mode of treatment will always be avoidance. So the family will generally work with an allergy specialist and hopefully a dietitian to develop an allergy plan, and also ensure that obviously appropriate substitutions are made to meet nutritional requirements. So I guess that's where the dietitian really has a role, particularly if it's things like, a cow's milk protein allergy in a young baby. That would be something where we really need to make sure that we are offering an appropriate substitute, because we know how important cow's milk or breast milk and formula are for our growing child in their earlier life.
Yeah, well, even though there's no cure at this stage, at least there's lots of ways in which you can either avoid the allergens or get the right help and support. So it sounds like there's lots of ways in which you can get that help today. So do children tend to grow out of allergies, Liv?
Yeah, so the good news is that many children will grow out of allergies, and in particular milk and egg allergies, which are quite common in young children, they will often grow out of by the time they're 2 or 3. So there is definitely hope out there, that a lot of children will eventually grow out of them.
Yeah, well, that's good to know. To think that your child will always have something they've got to live with, like an allergic reaction to certain foods, etc., could be quite hard to come to terms with, I'm sure, as a parent. So it's great to know that they could potentially grow out of it. That's awesome. So how do you introduce allergens typically? I know we talked a little bit about this in our first episode that we did, but I think it'd be great to know a bit more about it and have some more practical ways to give parents some tools to help support them when introducing allergens.
Yeah, sure. So when it comes to introducing allergens, what we found out from the most up-to-date research is that eggs should actually be one of the first foods given to bub, obviously aside from milk in the form of breast milk and formula. Aside from that, the other allergens really can be given in whatever order, but we do want to make sure that they're exposed to all of those allergens by the time that they're 11 months old.
Yeah.
Now, the best way to do this, so we'll use egg as the example, is We would hard boil an egg, making sure that the yolk was completely cooked through. The reason being is that a child's immune system is not properly developed. So if it's not cooked through, there is potential for some bacteria to be there. Anyway, we'd get our hard boiled egg and then we would mash it up really well. And we'd start by just mixing 1/4 of a teaspoon into a puree that baby had already accepted. So for example, say baby is very much comfortable with having pumpkin or sweet potato, you would mix 1/4 of a teaspoon into that pumpkin or sweet potato puree. That would be day one. Then on the second day, you would increase that to 1/2 teaspoon. And then on the third day, you'd increase it to 1 teaspoon. Now, with those 3 days of exposure, you should be able to establish if there is any kind of allergic reaction. The important thing to note here is often reactions don't actually occur on the first exposure. It can be the second or third exposure. That's why we really encourage multiple days of exposure before we declare that a child is not allergic or intolerant to it. However, once it's accepted and tolerated, we really want to make sure that we are including it as a regular part of the child's diet. And when we say regular, this really is two times a week. So we should make sure that we are having eggs twice a week in baby's diet. When it comes to something like nuts, it's best to do nuts in the form of a smooth nut butter or a nut powder, or even use something like a nut flour. So with almonds, for example, you can do like almond flour or almond meal.
Yeah, well, these are great tips. I think it's so great to have a bit of insight into how you can practically apply these things in your day-to-day life and help to introduce those allergens. So thanks so much. When is the best time to introduce allergens to your little one typically?
Basically, the recommendations that we use are based on the ASCIA. So ASCIA is the Australian Society of Clinical Immunology and Allergies, and also the World Health Organization recommendations. And so basically, these two authorities say that we should introduce solids around the 6 months age, but not before 4 months. So this basically creates a window between 4 and 6 months as the most appropriate time to introduce solids. Now, this is a really key time because from the moment that a child is then 6 months old, they no longer have the iron stores they require. So it's important that they are getting that supplementary food to then be able to meet their increased iron requirements. However, you also need to make sure, in terms of determining the right time, you need to make sure that the baby is showing signs of readiness. The key things to look out for in terms of your signs of readiness is, number one, definitely the ability to hold their neck upright. So even if you are supporting them, they can still hold their neck upright so that it's not falling, which can basically create a choking hazard.
Yeah, of course.
The other thing would definitely be an interest in food, reaching for your food, and also opening their mouth if you were to bring a spoon near. So showing that they are quite interested. So when they are in that period between 4 and 6 months and showing these signs is when it is appropriate to start solids.
Yeah, I remember some of these key signs with my babies actually, and it's so helpful to know what to look for. So thanks so much for that. In your opinion, Olivia, what is best not to do? I think there's lots about what to do, but not so much about what you shouldn't do. So if you could just take us through some of the not to do's, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, sure. So I guess a couple of key things I'd say not to do. The first one would definitely be to avoid introducing new foods before bedtime. So the reason for this is, as I've mentioned, an allergic reaction will take place between 5 minutes and 2 hours. So you really want your child to be up for 2 hours after they have a new food so that you can watch for any allergic reaction. You don't want to be giving them a dinner meal and then basically putting them down to bed if the dinner meal includes something that they haven't tried before. So I usually say try a new food in the first half of the day and ideally after a nap so that you can observe them for a little while. The other thing would be also to not introduce new foods and allergens when it's a long weekend or if you're going to be far away from emergency services. Because in the rare case of a severe allergic reaction, you want to be able to reach the hospital as soon as possible.
Yeah, that makes sense. Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. Another thing, and apparently this is something that they used to do back in the day. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but is they would hold nut parties. Now, this is strongly recommended not to do.
Okay.
But basically what would happen is people would go in, say, their mother's group, and they'd decide that they would all introduce peanuts on the same day. So they might give their children, peanut butter sandwiches. Now, the issue with this is that if there is an allergic reaction in, say, one child, it can almost create like a false hysteria in the other children, and they basically create a negative association with that food. Also, obviously, if you have all of these, mothers or fathers with their children suddenly thinking they've had an allergic reaction and racing into the hospital, it can obviously create quite a headache and, a nightmare for the hospital staff as well. So this is really not encouraged. Yeah. And then finally, the last recommendation would be to not withhold the introduction of allergens beyond the age of 1. And the reason is because even though this was previous guidelines, we have actually seen a massive spike in the incidence of allergies as a result of holding back. And so it's basically been shown that it is better to expose them early so that when they have it, that their body doesn't perceive it basically as a threat.
Yeah, they're great tips. I think it's so good to know some of those things because, like we said, you get told what you should do, but often not what you shouldn't do. So that's so helpful. So what milk would you give a baby typically if they have sort of a cow's milk protein allergy? Because I think there's so many milks out on the market now. What would you typically recommend there?
Yeah, so definitely. So obviously, when it comes to a cow's milk protein allergy, this is not just your lactose intolerance, we're talking about the actual protein in milk.
Yeah.
So this will depend on whether the child is breastfed or formula fed. In the case of a child that is breastfed, this would require the mother to completely cut dairy out of her diet. Now, this would include everything. So I'm even talking, those pieces of chocolate you might be snacking on at night. Sorry, mums. But really any little bit of milk protein can then pass through mum's breast milk and cause a reaction in the child. So it would require complete elimination in their diet. In the case of a child who's formula fed, the first option would be to try a soy-based formula. It is important to note that usually a baby that does have a cow's milk allergy will also likely have a goat's milk allergy, as the actual structure of the milks are quite similar. So there's no point really, once you decide that your child does have a cow's milk protein allergy, to then try goat's milk. It's best to move on to a soy-based formula. If there was an issue with that, you could then potentially try what's called a hydrolyzed formula, where it's already sort of pre-digested. However, that really is a last port of call because they don't taste particularly great and are often actually not that well tolerated by children. So we definitely try for something like a soy would be the first port of call for a formula-fed baby.
Okay, yeah, I have heard of other parents talking about this. I've never personally been through that with breastfeeding or bottle feeding for myself because my children didn't really have those massive allergies, like I mentioned, more intolerances. So, but it's good to know there's a lot of information out there, and there are so many different types of milks and things on the market now. So we're very lucky, I think, to have all the options out there. So what types of rashes, just going back to rashes, what are the types of rashes that are out there that you could look out for, I guess, to be mindful of when it comes to allergic reactions?
Look, it will really vary from child to child, and it can be all over. It could just be, on their trunk, on their arms, around their mouth. It might be swelling, spots, welts, can even cause the throat to swell up, making it difficult to breathe. Sometimes you'll see the whole face will completely swell up with a rash. The reaction really is child dependent, and it would also depend on the offending protein that the child had ingested. It is also important to note that with children who have eczema is often a pre-indicator of a child that might end up developing an allergy. So, however, in saying that, it doesn't mean that all children that have eczema will end up with allergies. So please don't, immediately think, oh my God, my child has eczema, they're going to end up with allergies. But there definitely is links with that.
Okay.
But look, some children, it depends on the severity of the allergy. It really can vary from child to child. When I was studying, I learned about a situation where a child was so allergic that the mother could be cooking an egg in the same room, and basically the egg particles could pass through the air and cause a reaction in that child. They didn't actually even ingest the food themselves.
Wow.
Or hear stories about like a mother who's eaten peanut butter and kisses her baby and it causes a reaction. So it really can vary from child to child.
Yeah, thanks so much for highlighting these for everyone listening. I think it's really good to know, as we mentioned earlier, just knowing a bit about what to look for, what's involved, what it might look like for parents. So is a peanut allergy still amongst the most common and have the most severe reactions? Because I think there's a lot of sort of hype around certain allergens. Is that still the case?
Yeah, definitely. Look, I'd definitely say it was one of the most common, and it's really up there with cow's milk protein and eggs with those younger children. In saying that though, because obviously egg and cow's milk are exposed to children much earlier on, egg and cow's milk would be more common when the child is younger, but as they grow older and are more likely to increase their intake of peanuts, peanut does sort of take over those egg and milk increase in incidence, and by 4 years of age it would have taken over those two. In terms of the degree of reaction though, as I've said, it really does vary from child to child, so I couldn't definitively say that it was the most severe reaction because it depends on what they're allergic to, how much they've had, and how severe their allergy is.
Yeah, well, there's so many mixed messages out there, and with Google these days, you start to Google something, there's so much information, so it's kind of good to know from someone who specialises in this area a bit more about that, I think, because it can be a bit scary for people and they don't necessarily know what the current sort of research is. That's great. So what other tips could you give parents with babies who have a suspected allergy, Liv? Is there certain things you would tell people about, some major things you want to be looking for if you've got a baby you suspect has allergies?
As I touched on before, as soon as I think that a child has a suspected food allergy, I'd recommend keeping a very thorough food and symptom diary. So when I say that, I mean, writing down what they've eaten, how much they've eaten, and what symptoms have occurred. Is it just a rash around their mouth? Is it changes in their stools? Is it them being particularly irritable? So writing all of this down. Then I would definitely book in with your GP, because ultimately you'll need a referral from your GP to get into the allergen clinic. So book in with your GP first. I would cease giving that offending food and consider doing what we call a challenge with the doctor or the allergist. So this is where you would sit in a controlled environment and expose them to it. Obviously, the benefit of being in the doctor's clinic is they obviously have the adrenaline on hand, which would be the first mode of treatment for an allergic reaction. And then ultimately the goal would be to get a referral to the allergy clinic so that they can undergo the proper testing as required and develop a proper allergy plan. Because when a child then goes to school and preschool, etc., with an allergy, they will need to supply an allergy plan to those facilities to ensure that it's properly managed.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Olivia. I'm sure that your insights have been so helpful to understand the role that food plays, and I guess when it comes to allergies for parents. So I really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much.
My absolute pleasure. It is such a daunting area, and I think just, clearing it up and people knowing what to do can hopefully reduce a bit of the panic if they are in the unfortunate situation where they do think that their child might have an allergy.
Yeah, absolutely. So for more information on allergies and babies' nutrition, you can visit www.nourishingbubs.com or follow them on Instagram @nourishingbubs. Thank you so much for taking the time to tune in today. I hope you found this helpful. Don't forget to subscribe and tell your friends about this podcast, and if you like listening, please leave us a review. See you next time.